Over the last 10 years, immigration has become one of the most important and controversial issues in American life. In this week's episode of Rufo and Lomez, we're going to tease out the big picture questions about immigration: who's here, who's coming, who's contributing, and what does it mean to be an American? The answers are not straightforward. We'll give you a little bit of history, a little philosophy, a little policy, and at the end, a little humor. We'll tell you who is more American, me or Lomez. Lomez, I saw on the internet this week somebody accusing you of being a foreign agent based in India.
Yeah.
And this caused me grave concern. What's the story?
I've been found
out. Are you
out.
who you say you are? Like, what's going on?
Yeah. I've been accused of being a rage bait account located in India. Okay,
honestly,
you got me.
Seems like possible. It seems possible.
Okay, look, I'm in Hyderabad right now. I'm at one of these H-1B fraud, like industrial scale H-1B fraud farms. I'm rubber stamping fake university credentials for my people here. I'm getting a small cut of this, feeding them into the H-1B pipeline at Infosys. Okay, so I'm doing the needful here. It's all true. I'm in India. But these are the wages of globalism. Okay. So I apologize for nothing.
That seems fair. At least you're owning up to it. You told me you were based in Montana. You had this very compelling backstory. But we're just going to roll with it. If you are,
we're all just global citizens
agent,
now, Chris. Yeah. These borders don't matter. They're meaningless abstractions. Okay. We are global citizens. It's a singular humanity. There is one race, the race of humanity. We are all the same. We are all pursuing the same goals and interests here. So please, enough with the fascist rhetoric. Okay,
that's
insisting on national identities.
That's right. No, we don't have a national identity. We're very skeptical of the idea. But we are going to talk about this question, which seems to be on everyone's mind. It's the question of immigration. And I know you have a different history. You've been thinking about the immigration question for a long time in a serious way. I'm a bit kind of later to the game. I would say in my teens and 20s, it was lower on my list of issues that I was really thinking about. But all thought has now converged. And it's a really messy debate. It's not always clear who's on which side. There are different right-wing factions. There are different left-wing factions. There's some right-left overlap, like libertarians, neoliberals. They've kind of tried to occupy the center. But before we get into the answers, which of course we have and we're going to share, what are the stakes and what are the real questions writ large as we think about the issue of immigration?
I mean, it's such a huge topic. It's so hard to even know where to begin. How do you wrap your arms around the question of mass immigration, especially as it's played out over the last, since the last big immigration law went into effect in the 1960s. Hart-Celler, of course, started this new process of taking in foreign nationals. And at the time, it should be said, like in 1970, we had something like 5% of our population was foreign born. Now it's like 17%, something like 53 million foreign-born people are in the United States. That is the highest total ever by a lot, and it's also the highest as a matter of percentage. People will talk about these previous immigration waves, and of course there were big previous immigration waves, famously from around 1880 through 1920. You had the quote unquote Ellis Island wave. There was a period of some slowdown during World War I, but otherwise it was just this ramp of, Western European, Central European, even some Eastern European immigration into the United States. But even then, the percentage of the total population was lower. It was around, it capped out in, I think, 1920 around like 15% before we went into this immigration moratorium in 1924. So we'll come back to that. Like, what were the consequences of that first wave? How did we survive that first wave and maintain some kind of cultural continuity? But I think first we just have to grapple with the enormous scale of what we are currently dealing with, the unprecedented scale of what we are dealing with. And you know, you brought up that I've been thinking about this for a while. When early in the 2000s, when I first became like sort of politically aware, was not happy about what was going on in the Iraq war, didn't identify with sort of Bush era conservatism, didn't identify with sort of liberal politics, saw what was going on in California, my home state where I'd lived, and recognized immigration as this sort of central feature of political life. Nobody was talking about this outside of two distinct factions. You had like the Bernie Sanders left. If you go back and look at early clips of Bernie Sanders when he first came to national prominence, immigration was something he talked about all the time.
The guest worker provisions in this bill, which will bring many hundreds of thousands of lower wage workers into this country, will only make a bad situation even worse. And I think at a time when the middle class is shrinking, the last thing we need is to bring over a period of years millions of people into this country who are prepared to lower wages for American workers. The idea that in the United States of America today, we need more people to come from other countries who will work at high-tech jobs, whether it's computer programming or other information technology jobs, because we just don't have the workers in America, is absolute nonsense.
And you had scholars like George Borjas at Harvard who were nominally on the left, people like Mickey Kaus, who was on the left, talking about immigration and the effects that mass immigration was having, especially on the wages and the sort of labor fortunes of our lower class citizens, people without college degrees, white and blacks in particular, were getting the brunt of this effect of mass immigration coming in. And then you had people like Steve Saylor, for example, Larry Oster, Peter Brimlow talking about the effects of immigration. And they were completely pushed out of the conservative movement. Nobody in mainstream conservatism was talking about immigration restriction at all. It was the default position of mainstream conservatives up through the Obama years. Remember, after Mitt Romney lost the election, the RNC, or they wrote, exactly, they wrote this this paper review, this postmortem of the election, said we need to let in more people. We need to allow for another amnesty. This was the default view going into the 2016 election. Every single candidate other than Trump was pro-immigration. Even people like, Rick Perry, for example, Texas guy, they were supporting in-state tuition for non-legal residents. Everybody was clamoring to virtue signal, frankly, about the DREAM Act and everything else. So anyway, this is just all to say, it's not a surprise to me. This is new to someone like yourself. It's new to most people. They never thought about it. And there was never any money or institutional support behind talking about immigration restriction. This is an arena that belongs strictly to the Cato sort of libertarian wing of the right. They dominated the conversation, and that's all anyone ever heard. And so it's just become the case now that people are starting to talk about this in a more sensible and balanced way.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because at the time it was a fringe position on the left and the right. And the mainstream left thought about changing demographics as a way to achieve a permanent political majority. And so they were able to kind of shunt aside the Sanders wing, the Mickey Kaus wing, the other folks who were raising questions, who really represented the traditional labor left. And this is something that's quite obvious. I spent a lot of time in Memphis, and including in many of the warehouses and other entry-level employment places. And you could see that the new immigrants from Latin America were working harder, working longer for less money and less, and fewer benefits than the native-born Black Americans. And so there was real enmity. But if you were part of the professional class, this was good for business. So you could hire cheaper labor, you could hire more insecure labor, you had more options, more competition for these entry-level jobs. that kept those wages suppressed and kept management in a position of advantage. And you also saw that even in home services. Well, it used to be in California, you'd have a Japanese gardener. I remember hearing that phrase as a young kid and had some Japanese American friends that said, oh yeah, my parents were in the nursery business or the agriculture business. And then that was basically totally replaced by Latin American labor.
Yep.
But on the right too, you'd had the Chamber of Commerce position for the same reasons, actually, was able to push aside the right-wing critique of mass immigration. And consequently, many of the kind of right-wing critics of mass immigration, some of them I think were, substantive, serious, sober, but you also had a lot of real fringe personalities that then they were able to hook that onto. And you had people that were, opposed to immigration that were also supporting some kind of very, very unpopular, very controversial, very ugly ideas even. And so the political center was totally changed, totally dominated.
Yeah.
And as you said, it's kind of extraordinary because Trump has, both the stature, the business experience, the celebrity, but also just the force of personality to take this issue, to understand that it was a latent issue that, again, no one had talked about in decades in a serious way.
Yeah.
And then he brought it to the forefront so that it's been this constant constant source of debate, source of inquiry for now 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think he successfully changed it. And the other thing that I think has happened is that those numbers have accelerated. It's become more visible in people's lives. Technology has changed. So we're asking ourselves too, hey, wait a minute, the farm labor necessity, let's say, dating back to the early and mid 20th century. Well, if robots take over these farm labor positions, do we really need cheap labor, et cetera? And also, we've seen other countries in Europe, for example, that have had really catastrophic consequences of mass immigration. I think for the most part, because they've selected from different sources of mass immigration.
Yeah.
But you go to London and you say, man, this was such a catastrophic mistake, total cultural incompatibility. And these are now the questions that are surfacing in the US. And I would say, just to set the stage, we're in a much better position than Western Europe vis-a-vis immigration, vis-a-vis the natural or even policy-based selection. And yet, I think it is a really important issue to start thinking about. And these bigger questions, what does it mean to be an American? What is the proper policy based on the proportion of foreign born in the United States? What are the lessons from 20th century immigration? These are, in a sense, new questions that people are just discovering now. Lomez, it's the holiday season. It's time for some cheer. It's time for being at home with a fire. It's time to deal sometimes with difficult relatives, which means for many people, it's time for alcohol. And want to know, what is your drink of choice between Thanksgiving and New Year?
Chris, of course, my answer to this is Flying Ace whiskey. Okay. Clean. It's the perfect whiskey, not just for drinking straight, but seriously too, like as a mixer, I've been experimenting with some hot toddies, maybe a little apple cider, a cinnamon stick. I'm gonna use the Flying Ace for some eggnog, which is maybe not typical, but I have high hopes for it. So, for me, for my family, for my wife, it's Flying Ace.
Well, that's a ringing endorsement, and there's a way that you're classing this up with all the various mixers, and a cinnamon stick is a bold one. I think it's very appropriate, very exciting, and I agree. The Flying Ace whiskey, it's a great bottle. It's very simple. It's good stuff, made in America, good company. And I think it's something that everyone should have in their liquor cabinet over the holiday season. And so if you are curious and you want to level up your game and maybe even match the extraordinary taste and style of someone like Lomez, you should head on over to flyingacespirits.com and use promo code BLAZE for free shipping. That's flyingacespirits.com. Promo code BLAZE, free shipping. Order now before the holidays. Get it on your shelf and tell us what you think.
So I want to go back a little bit because while I hear what you're saying about some of the people who were talking about this, let's say 25, 30 years ago, and certainly, these are just like definitionally on the fringe. They weren't mainstream. They're over here, and that tends to attract, all sorts of, let's say, interesting idiosyncratic personalities who are going to have, when you tend to have, sort of out of center views on one thing that correlates with out of center views on other things. Okay. However, I want to be a little bit more charitable because what you had was a situation where at the time you could have someone like George Borjas at Harvard, for example, or Mickey Kaus, who talking about these like economic effects of mass immigration, and they are huge and they're very important. So, like one thing I want to just put this into perspective is it's not just that we have the most foreign-born people ever. We're also in a situation where we have the most native-born working-age men out of the labor force in our history. Something like 22% of our native-born working-age men are not even in the labor force. That means they're not even looking for work. They've been completely pushed out to the margins. They're, on welfare. This is a huge net cost to our country. Again, back in 1970, this number was something like 5%, certainly in the single digits. So there has been this total displacement of our native-born workforce. This is all very important. This has huge catastrophic effects on our sort of underclass, our lower class, our non-educated. And this is something Trump obviously spoke to. There was real economic anxiety that this immigration was speaking to. However, there was the cultural anxiety about identity. Was it okay to just point out the fact that whites were going to be a minority in the country? What are the effects of that? What does that mean in terms of who we are, in terms of cultural cohesion? So those guys asking those questions, we're asking legitimate questions. These are legitimate questions to ask. And on the flip side, we were saying like Democrats realized that this was a way to sort of jigger the votes, jigger the populace in order to get what they want, to basically import a clientele coalition who they could count on voting for them. Now, that has started to kind of change. Trump was able to push some of these Hispanic voters in particular in 2024 into the red. But it's really important to remember the sort of electoral effects of this. And people like Ron Brownstein, who was a Democratic consultant, talked about this straightforwardly. Demographics was destiny. If we import more Hispanics, we win. We become a permanent majority. Okay, they were talking about it. It's okay then for the right to then say, hey, wait a minute. What about the counter argument? If this is what they're saying, how do we put up a defense against this? And I want to point out, depending on the studies you look at, and this is true of legal and illegal immigration, because illegals count in the census, and anybody who counts in the census applies for representation in the House. You have something like, depending on the numbers you look at, between 17 and 22 House seats that are determined by the foreign-born population. Okay, that is a huge number. That is a very large and significant electoral consequence for importing these new people who get to determine what our laws and our society looks like. And it's perfectly adequate to ask whether or not their cultural norms, their cultural practices. This is something we talked about in a previous episode. I want to refer listeners back to the work of the economist Garrett Jones and the culture transplant. It is totally okay to ask whether or not they are bringing in cultural norms and practices that are consistent with the country that we want to live in, the country we've known, and the country we want to have to pass down for our children and grandchildren. And just to assume that the United States has magic dirt. In other words, people are just going to come here, step on American soil, and drop all of the things that made them who they were in their home countries and somehow just sort of magically become American, as if we can even define what American is, which is a whole other question that we'll get to, is something that we have to address straightforwardly. We have to address without fear of being called names. We have to address with a certain amount of moral courage. And I have to say, it is heartening to see serious people on the right start to do this. And I think we are moving towards some positive answers on this front.
Yeah, I think part of it is that we lost the sense of self-confidence in our civilization after World War II, and then accelerating, into the 21st century. We went into default mode, and we felt like we were an exceptional civilization. We kind of forgot the reasons why. We forgot the idea of assimilation. We adopted this idea of multiculturalism. And in retrospect, it was the cause of a disaster, not just for immigration as a policy question, but for American identity, our national purpose, our national character, our national spirit. And you see then two things happening simultaneously, either one of which would be a challenge. But if you have them happening at the same time, it becomes an existential challenge. Both the assimilation machine, this idea that we put pressure on native-born and also non-native-born Americans to assimilate to a fixed idea of American culture, or at least a unified idea of American culture. We abandoned that idea. We let that machine go into total disrepair. And in fact, we had this suspicion as a culture, maybe that machine is racist, exploitative, evil. It's too white, it's too capitalistic, it's too individualistic, et cetera.
It's too Anglo-Protestant.
While at the same time,
it's too what we are.
Right. While at the same time, though, we're also increasing the share of people, and in absolute numbers, an extraordinary number of people who need to either be assimilated or guided into an alternative system, multiculturalism or what have you. And so our machine is breaking down just as we're trying to jam a huge number of inputs through the machine. And it's really not a surprise that we end up with this idea in total disrepair, and we have to rebuild it from first principles. And I think on the other hand, though, I'll make the case, the kind of case against, the counter case. Yes, American culture is an Anglo-Protestant culture. That's obvious. We speak English. We have a kind of Anglo-American system of laws, manners, norms, etc. The founders of the country were the predominant group were Anglo-Protestants. But even at that time, this is something I've been reading a lot about lately. America was already a mixed population in the 18th century, in the 1700s. Sure. And they noted that at the time. They said this is the most diverse population of any nation. You have it was limited mostly at that time to Europeans and then Africans in the Deep South. But amongst European populations, let's say in the north of the United States, or even before the United States was an entity, you had this mix, and they noted it. They said this is a population of mixed blood, and in fact, we've forged a new race. This is language straight from the pamphlets and literature of the 18th century. And so I think, again, contrasting with Europe, and look, my own experience, when I go into Italy, Italy cannot assimilate. It's never, especially in the modern period, has not had the necessity of assimilating cultures in a modern way. Whereas Americans, I'm more optimistic. And so as I look at this challenge, I think it's not impossible, but I think we have to simultaneously reduce the rate of change to say, hey, we need to stabilize the existing population, slow down immigration, totally stop illegal immigration. And we also need to have this debate of what are we assimilating people to? What is the identity that we hold as the ideal? What does it mean to be an American? And I think the pure, intellectual, abstract, creedal nation people, well, if you say, I love the Constitution, then, bing, bang, boom, you're in. Well, yes, of course, that's part of it. The pure kind of ethno-centric vision. If you're not a congregationalist, London-born, London descendants of Londoners, you can't be an American. That's not quite right either. And so I think there's this interesting middle ground where we can actually forge a popular conception. And the basics of it, to me, look like this. This is a fundamentally Anglo-Protestant country. That culture has produced kind of a spectacular, almost near miraculous civilization. The ideas of the founding, which grew out of the Christian and Anglo-Protestant tradition, are universalist in nature. But as the founders understood, not all groups can assimilate to this ideal in the same manner, and there's nothing automatic about that, but it requires a deliberate effort. And again, I say that as half Anglo, half Italian, recognizing that my Anglo side has more of a claim historically, philosophically, and the Italian side has to assimilate to that. Like my father assimilated to an Anglo culture. And he retained his Italian culture and heritage and love for that. Of course, you're not saying you need to become kind of self-hating in that way, but you have to recognize even other white European groups need to assimilate to a dominant culture. And the critical race theory people are dead wrong when they say, oh, this is about whiteness. It's like, okay, I guess what you're saying, there's some resonance, but it's actually wrong because it's more particular than that. Greeks and Italians and Lithuanians and Spaniards, for example, are a different civilization from the Anglo-American civilization, and they too need to assimilate in order to be successful and in order to continue the tradition of this country.
Yeah, I mean, this is all right, and I do want to give due merit to the idea of a melting pot, or this actually goes back to Emerson. Emerson used the phrase, I think, smelting pot or smeltering pot, something like that, to describe this sort of unique quality of America to absorb and sort of meld together these various traditions and sort of ethnic groups. But at the same time, if you do go back and look at these laws, America was a sort of self-consciously white-dominated country. Again, this is a descriptive fact, okay? It's embedded in the legal framework of the country. And I think that what we need to figure out is whether or not we can maintain a kind of moral commitment to preserving the dignity of any given individual and recognizing the merit of any given individual on the one hand, and understanding that that individual merit can potentially find its way into a more sort of complete and holistic and group level understanding of what our identity is as a nation, and to merely acknowledge that it is an Anglo-Protestant country does not at all efface or erase that individual identity, as you were talking about in your own case with
Correct.
Your Italian father, in my case with, I'm half Jewish on one side, Croatian on the other, peak Ellis Islander, but whose grandparents both fought in World War II and earned Purple Hearts, and through the sort of crucible of fighting a war on behalf of this nation. And in the midst of an immigration pause, when all of these people from these various places were forced into a kind of collective consciousness of who they were as a country, were able to become American. And now it's has to be said that process of assimilation that happened across the middle of the 20th century after, the great Ellis Island wave had long-term effects, indelible permanent effects on the nature of what the United States was. But you can still recognize a Anglo-Protestant core that everybody was orienting themselves towards in law, in custom. There's this great book by a controversial mid-century sociologist from Harvard, a guy named John Marie Cudahy, The Ordeal of Civility. Are you familiar with The Ordeal of Civility, Chris?
I am. My Jewish American friends have pointed me in this direction very quietly, and I will leave it to you to describe.
Look,
this seems like you maybe have a greater insight. Yeah.
Well, it's a wonderful book. I mean, it's really good and really insightful, and has been, I think, very unfairly maligned by a kind of universalist, egalitarian ethos, a sort of multicultural ethos, and it's pointed as a kind of example of this coercive and mean-spirited kind of assimilationist rhetoric that was being imposed on
summarize the main thesis of the book.
Well, okay, the main thesis is that, and Cudahy is critiquing the Jewish experience in particular, and the quote unquote Ostjuden, the Jews from mostly Eastern Europe that came during the Ellis Island wave. Of course, the United States had some percentage of Jews going back to the founding, largely Western European, largely German. And they were very much opposed, by the way. There's like an interesting interfactional history there, and these big disputes, cultural and otherwise, between Western European Jews and Eastern European Jews. But anyway, Cudahy is observing the particular way in which Eastern European Jews were having a certain difficulty assimilating themselves into the sort of Anglo-Protestant norms of the United States, but of Western Europe in general. And he points to a number of figures like Marx, Freud, etc., who are demonstrating a certain resistance and resentment about a very sort of, let's say, modest and restrained Anglo-Protestant sort of default way of being in the world, and the difficulty of becoming that, of assimilating into that, and the tension between what it means to be an outsider. And this, by the way, Cudahy says in the book and elsewhere that his experience as an Irish Catholic helped him understand the particular difficulty of Eastern European Jews, because he was also an outsider and also from an outside culture, but that this tension creates some amount of ongoing resentment. And what can happen is that these larger populations reject that Anglo-Protestant culture into which they are assimilating, and this can create all sorts of cultural and social upheaval that is manifest in, let's say, like far left politics, things like certain kinds of avant-garde, cultural subversion, etc. But nonetheless,
anarchism. Italians had the anarchism in the 1920s, of course.
Correct. All that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, it is incumbent on these new waves to find their way into this kind of Anglo-Protestant way of being. So anyway, it's a very good book that sort of details some of this history and the difficulties around it, and it is extremely difficult. We would be very naive to think that this just happens automatically. It actually happens through a great deal of coercion. And it requires some will on the part of the people coming in. So, for example, Chris, maybe in your case, certainly in my case, I go back and look at the names of my great-great-grandparents, the first names, and they're all sort of ethnically
ethnically coded.
Coded.
Do you know exactly what era they arrived?
end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, before World War I.
Got it.
They were mostly all here, but every single one of the second generation all had Anglophone names, okay? And I know it's sort of trivial. It seems superficial. But look around at the new coming immigrant groups. Which ones of them give their children Anglophone names, American traditional names? Do we even have American traditional names anymore, by the way? Like, sometimes I wonder. So maybe it's not altogether their fault.
East Asians do so at greater rates, and I've noticed in particular Chinese Americans like to take British royal names. So it'll be Penelope and Victoria, etc.
Yes.
Especially the Chinese groups from Singapore, from Hong Kong, from Shanghai, former British colonial territories.
Yeah, when I was teaching, it was a lot of like Franks and Henrys and this sort of thing. But
it's
yes,
great.
Carry on.
It's great. Yeah, I think it's good. And
yes, it is good.
It's interesting. So I'll share a bit about my experience. Of course, as half Anglo, I want to teach you in particular about what it means to be an American.
Please.
Our people, the not the Rufos, but the Fergusons and the Passmores, my other side, were quite deeply rooted. So we're going to give a tutorial for the Lomez's. But even into the 20th century, my father came to the United States in 1961 as a young boy. And it's really interesting to hear his stories about arriving in Philadelphia. They had a Catholic parish that was called St. Donato's in South Philly. And it was all people from San Donato, the little town, and then other little towns around it. And there was an Italian neighborhood, there was an Irish neighborhood, there was a Black neighborhood, and then there was a kind of WASP neighborhood. And each of these communities operated as a patchwork. And there were always suspicions, like the Irish kids would make fun of the Italian kids for having like a fried egg sandwich in their lunch. And, the Jewish kids, the Black, they were fighting. There were leather jackets. It was like, West Side Story or whatever. But what's really interesting is that even in this kind of the broader community was kind of a heterogeneous community, but even in the homogenous Italian community, there was a real imperative towards assimilation. Yeah. And so the nuns at the Catholic parish, for example, my father arrives from Italy. He's 11 years old, and he remembers like speaking Italian in school was strictly forbidden. And they would come and they would rap you across the knuckles with a ruler if you were speaking Italian to your friend, in the seat behind you. And there was just a relentless, we're here to be in America. Yeah. We're grateful for this opportunity. We have to assimilate into the general culture. We have to adapt the customs and the norms as far as we can. We can still practice Catholicism. We can still have our Italian festivals. But the home culture becomes almost a ceremonial culture. And then you hope that your subsequent generations become fully American. They had that embedded in their own culture. And then the broader civilization, America as a whole, also pressed that from the outside. And then, fast forward now, all of those ethnic neighborhoods and enclaves have been kind of dispersed. People move to the suburbs, and people kind of move on. They move up, and their children and grandchildren are, fully assimilated Americans, and I think could be considered almost, at that point, a kind of an ethnic American identity. Which of course, with exceptions, obviously, there are still like Italian American cartoon characters in like New Jersey. Who like their great grandparents immigrated, but they still talk like this. So Bobby and Kenny, and it's like
Jersey Shore. Yeah,
I reject those people. Let me say that I reject the Jersey Shore American.
No, come on. We love our Jersey Shore Americans, okay?
I reject them as Italians. I reject them as Italians.
All right.
They're Americans, but come on. Let's be real here.
Let it be said for the record, Lomez is a defender of the Jersey Shore Americans, okay? Put your hair gel in, go to the club, listen to some techno, do whatever you got to do. In a moderate amount, okay? Small number of our beautiful Jersey Shore Americans. We'll allow it as a treat.
Okay, well, we're at odds, because I think maybe revoking the TPS status, the temporary protected status of all Jersey Americans, would be a good Trump policy. I'm suspicious. Yeah.
Let me throw a provocative idea out here. That's been kind of tumbling around in my head, and I don't mean for this to be like too bleak or pessimistic. Maybe it's not, but I'm thinking of the concept of asabiya. Do you know this concept? It's Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century North African historian, 13th century maybe. This idea of asabiya, it's like it's the spirit of the nation that these different groups can kind of subordinate themselves to, the subordination of self-interest to the nation. And any nation sort of depends on the spirit of asabiya. And this is something you would hear getting thrown around during the time of like 9/11. And certainly like World War II was this period of asabiya, okay? And it's great. The idea of it is great, that we can coalesce around a certain collective spirit. But the rub is that it requires, fortunately, war, some tremendous amount of violence, that you don't create nationhood without blood, all right? And if we are trying to construct or engineer a coherent and robust nationhood out of just this sort of like disparate accumulation, almost random accumulation of peoples from around the world, what binds this? I mean, okay, am I being too pessimistic?
I think you are, because in the example, even my father, this is post World War II immigration. The groups, you had fewer, of course, but you had groups that did successfully assimilate in the post World War II period. You had Vietnam, but that's kind of an anomaly. I don't think it has the kind of binding. In fact, has the opposite of the binding.
As with 9/11
identity.
These things, yeah.
And 9/11, right? You have 9/11. Okay. Yeah. These are obviously significant historical events, but I think you can have that, but it requires institutions that have the self-confidence to impose a value system on newcomers. And, we don't have that anymore. And in fact, the institutions that we have in the United States today are precisely the opposite. They want the newcomers to impose their value systems from back home onto them. And I think that is ultimately, as it relates to immigration, this interesting ideological and intellectual question about what is the value system of America's elite institutions, for example. Harvard at one time, the Ivy Leagues, all of these kind of colonial era institutions, love them or hate them, had very clear sense of identity, a sense of responsibility, a sense of desire to govern. I think they still have that. There is that as a matter of status, as a matter of position in society. But they've filled up these institutions with people who hate the origins of those institutions.
Right.
And so Harvard, for example, I did a lot of reporting where they have these visiting scholars who do these programs to decolonize Harvard. Wait a minute. Or Claudine Gay, she had as president of Harvard, she said, we need to dename spaces at Harvard. We need to remove the portraiture of white men at Harvard, literally taking pictures of white people off the walls.
Yeah.
And then the replacement ideology is a mix of post-colonialism, critical race theory, gender ideology that serves to dissolve the very categories that those institutions should be upholding. And so, well, maybe I'm changing my mind. Maybe I do agree with you. In the abstract, no, it doesn't require a war or some civilizational catastrophe to test people's loyalties and bind them together if you have functioning institutions. But in our case, we have dysfunctional institutions that are unwilling to impose a system of values.
Yeah.
They don't even know what their system of values are. And in that case, again, we don't want war. We don't want chaos. We don't want hardship. But it's not happening now, and this is a big problem.
So let me just kind of like bring this back. I have a follow-up question, but I'm going to set this up by bringing it back to just like what's happened over the last 4 years. So we've had this massive immigration wave since the 1960s. Actually, during the 2010s, during the Obama years, while it was going much faster, like some of the illegal immigration numbers started to plateau a little bit. Then Trump comes in at like sort of flat lines. But then everybody sort of agrees that immigration is this huge problem, that we're losing track of who we are, what we stand for. And then like Biden gets in, he's not even a person. He's this just sort of like empty vessel. He's a collection of the sort of consciousness of the left, of the sort of liberal, not the left, but like the liberal establishment, the very people who are trying to undermine their own institutions at places like Harvard. And what they do immediately with him is not just like turn the immigration spigot back on, it's supercharged. Okay, we get in Biden's 4 years the equivalent of 12 years of immigration. The preceding 12 years combined ends up equaling what Biden does. Another like 8 million illegal immigrants, millions of these like getaway. They're not even processing people at the border. You have these insane quasi-legal, they're not legal. It's just like Alejandro Mayorkas just decides unilaterally, yes, we're going to start taking in people from Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, Venezuela, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, basically flying illegal immigrants, paying to fly illegal immigrants into the country to be resettled by these refugee programs, which includes a lot of these religious institutions. It includes HIAS, a Jewish institution, Church World Services, the Protestant institution, the Council of Catholic Bishops. Okay, they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars from DHS to do this. You have hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minors. Okay, we're just taking in the world. We're taking in the entire world. We completely ramp up every level of immigration. We abuse every single loophole in the system. And when I say we, I mean Alejandro Mayorkas, who should frankly be in jail and like tried for sedition.
I don't when I say that. We, I mean not me. I mean them.
I'm trying to ask a simple question. We've had thousands of people that got on C-17s and flew out of the most chaotic situation I've seen since the fall of Saigon. And I'm asking you, before they got on the plane, how many of them were vetted by the United States? Can you tell me what percentage?
Senator, I would posit, and I will confirm this, that well over 99% of them were fully screened and vetted before they boarded a flight.
You do know you're under oath. Are you telling this committee under oath that 99% of the people who got on these planes in Afghanistan were vetted by our government before they got on that plane?
I want to be very clear because precision...
Because you're not.
No. Senator, if I may, you are asking me about planes from transit countries, the third countries.
I'm talking about people who got on the plane in Kabul airport.
No, I can't speak to that.
Well, that's okay. Good.
Yeah. No, I'm serious. Like he belongs in a jail somewhere. I don't mean that. I'm not being facile here. Like I'm not being facetious at all. Now that said, okay, that's what they want. That's what they decided to do. And they do this just as they're accelerating all of this insane ideology around the woke stuff, which goes to what you were saying around Harvard. They are actively trying to undermine what it means to be an American, to just get rid of the entire substructure, the entire substrate foundation, the people, the ideas, everything on which a nation had been built. The idea is to get rid of all of it. Okay, my question to you is, that is observationally what's happening. Why? What? I actually don't know the answer to this, because on the one hand, you can say they're sort of like nihilistic. They're driven by this insane, almost like millenarian religious fervor. Like it has the same quality of sort of eschatology, like end times religiosity. But at the same time, these people are just simply bureaucrats. They're institutionalists. Like these are the, adults in the room. And there is a certain law, institutional law, like a sort of Darwinian law, that these institutions are going to do whatever they need to do in order to survive, in order to continue their own existence. Okay, so what is going on? Like, why? What explains this?
I think there's multiple layers, right? And so if you think of this as a pyramid, you have the elite, intellectual, and political class at the top. You have the NGO administrators in the middle, people who are kind of bound by economic incentives to want to continue these products, services, grants, et cetera. And then you have the mass of, let's call them NPR Americans. So they're kind of popular base, their popular justification. So let's go down the pyramid. At the very top, I think it's an ideological commitment. You have an enormous amount of guilt, of shame, And part of this is a sense of inferiority. And so I studied this in some elite institutions, let's say Harvard, for example. You have people who look at the accomplishments of American civilization, of the great figures in American history, of their forebears at an institution like Harvard. I mean, John Adams, Samuel Adams, some of the most brilliant minds of the colonial era. And they look at that and they simultaneously have a sense of kind of envy, resentment, hatred, but also a sense of inferiority. Like, we cannot actually live up to the expectations that these earlier people have established, and therefore we need to figure out a way to tear them down, to erase them, to endow them with the spirit of evil, and then to open up these institutions to the ideologies that spring naturally from those emotions of guilt, resentment, inferiority. And so you have this psychological complex at the top that translates into a system of status rewards. So if you're decolonizing Harvard, you're getting a promotion, a grant, tenure, a kudos, a lecture series, whatever.
Yeah.
If you're doing the boring staid work of investigating the historical contributions of Harvard towards the principles of the Anglo-American Constitution, you're like a loser. You're chased out of the institutions. That's not what's prized. At the middle level, you have career bureaucrats and grifters and scam artists and institution builders that are all extracting. And so you see this. You have former Biden officials that then dump out to the private sector or semi-private sector. They're getting the $1 million salaries running these NGOs that are processing unaccompanied minors through the border. It's like completely evil what they're actually doing. If you think about it, we're bringing over unaccompanied minors who don't speak English, have no education, have no foothold in the United States, and we're just letting them loose. Even if you just ask the most basic questions, you realize that's something very disturbing, very wrong.
Yeah.
And then at the bottom, you have NPR Americans who are just mindlessly consuming the narrative that is coming out of the media. And this narrative is Trump bad, Wall bad, conservatives bad, American bad, migrants good, refugees good, tolerance good, compassion good, empathy good.
Right.
And it's just, you can see it. It's like completely just mindless, lemming-like pursuit of whatever media narrative is established at the top. And so you have it. And the tragedy of Biden is that Biden is actually an Ellis Islander American. I actually think he loves this country. I might get a lot of hate for this, but I actually think Biden, like you see Biden, because of his age, Biden's actual political prime was when he's visiting like an ethnic diner in Youngstown, Ohio, talking to steel workers, kissing babies, showing up at the Ukrainian Day parade or whatever. Like, he was actually a political figure from another era. Then he attains power in a post-American, post-Ellis Islander country, and then he's just there as a symbol of something that calms people down, that is somewhat vaguely reassuring. He's a kind of grandfather figure representing this successful assimilation of Irish Catholics, let's say. But beneath him is this just awful regime of people who are just revving up this engine of chaos. And I just think it's the one untold story of the Trump years that no one has quite put together in a coherent way.
Yeah. And even then, I am like
more cynical.
I think that's like a good story. I think that makes a lot of sense. That explains like 90% of it or close to it. But there is a kind of like missing. There's a gap in my understanding of the motivations or the kind of naivety or willful neglect that otherwise smart people ought to be able to look at this situation that we're in, which is frankly, it's totally unprecedented and frankly intolerable. The whole thing is going to sort of tip over unless something is done. And yet these otherwise smart people just kind of look at it and sort of shrug, or, maybe I give too much credit to, the smart liberals who should know better. I think some of them are actually starting to come around, but only out of political expediency. So actually, strangely enough, a guy who's been sort of reasonable on this question is Fareed Zakaria. Okay. He's been talking about this for some amount of time and the problem of immigration. And the reason is because he at least knows well enough to talk to the right people about what's animating the right. So, he recently had a book out, and part of it is based on a conversation he had with Steve Bannon. Okay. It's like Fareed Zakaria goes and talks to Steve Bannon to try to make sense of what's going on in the world. And Fareed Zakaria at least is smart enough to just reflect that honestly on the page and just sort of like understand what's animating this. But so many others just won't acknowledge that this is a problem at all. But
Fareed Zakaria almost has the same problem as Joe Biden. Fareed Zakaria's fundamental problem is that he's a political commentator from another era. I remember in high school, growing up watching Fareed Zakaria GPS or whatever his show was at the time.
Still is.
And is it really? Okay.
Yeah.
But look, that was during the era. Remember the Thomas Friedman book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree? Do you remember that book?
Oh, yeah, baby. The World is Flat, too. There's another one.
The World is Flat, whatever, all those books. And so there was an idea, and in some ways it's actually it's actually appealing, and in other ways it's less appealing. But there was an idea that there was a American-led, globalized economic and cultural system. You brought in, high value, high entrepreneurship, highly educated immigrants. They would assimilate into, the kind of Lexus factory of the future.
Yeah.
And it would power American dominance for another century. And there are bits and pieces, and we probably disagree, but there are bits and pieces of that I think are still salvageable, but they completely missed this other element. They missed immigration selection. They missed immigration density. They missed the downsides of the globalized economic system. And they missed essentially the underlying kind of rupture that Trump was able to ride to the presidency.
Yeah.
And so these visions are now being contested. And look, I think the right on our side, I think there are people who are also being somewhat naive. Like, how much can you do? But yeah, Zakaria, is smart. Zakaria's smart. He's intellectually curious. He's honest enough.
He's
relative to
honest.
Other commentators,
Yeah.
But I also just think he's not going to get it because his formative kind of intellectual development happened during an era that kind of surprisingly seems to be over.
Yeah. I have to say too, I mean, okay, the fundamental sort of ignorance that animates all of that worldview and explains, for example, the disaster of our global war on terror in this period of time where people like Friedman were not only trying to get us to sort of put a McDonald's in every country under some sort of fantastical idea that, if you have a McDonald's, you don't go to war or whatever, that global liberal democracy could just be exported everywhere because all people are the same. And if you have the right operating system, call it, liberal democracy, you can upload that into whatever sort of human hardware exists in any part of the world, and it'll all just kind of work the same. And the truth is, the world is full of all sorts of different kinds of peoples. And just as you cannot export liberal democracy everywhere, so too there's a very different approach that needs to be taken when you're talking about bringing in immigrants from one part of the world versus another. There are just differences. And by the way, I just have to point this out because one of the ironies of people who talk about diversity, for example. Diversity is our strength. Okay, what is diversity? Diversity is difference. Diversity definitionally means that people are different. But the moment you ask them to explain the differences between one group versus another, who ostensibly comprise this beautiful diversity, they like short circuit. They can't bring themselves to acknowledge that any of these different peoples from different parts of the world are different. The farthest they will
you
go.
You can't use summary statistics. Everyone is an individual. Everyone is an individual.
The farthest you can go is to say that, well, they make different kinds of food. Okay, well, that's great. So now diversity, this great strength of ours, in fact, our greatest strength is just that we have different kinds of food. I like different kinds of food well enough, but I'm sorry. That's not where
we know you're eating Croatian
ends.
food. We know you're eating, latkes and whatever else, gefilte fish. We know what you're eating, Lomez.
It's true. You know what? But I keep it in the house, okay? I don't impose that on the rest of you, okay?
You've tried to force the gefilte fish onto others. I know this. Yeah.
I think it's that inability to acknowledge that different peoples in aggregate as populations are different. And when you're talking about certain kinds of policies like immigration, you are not talking about individuals. It is impossible to measure the merit of every single individual that we might want to bring into the country. Actually, I take that back. It is possible, and that's what we should be doing. And that would basically grind immigration to a halt, which is fine. But at the way we're doing it now, that is not what's happening. We're bringing in groups. And, you look at the statistics, only like 15% of immigrants in this country are selected on individual merit. And even then, we can probably say that among those 50%, only 50% or so are selected on real measures of merit. The rest of the immigrant population, the 85%, are just randomly selected refugees or these
and all of the illegal immigrants
and all the illegal immigration. Okay, these are and we're taking in people at a population level, and therefore we need to be honest. I know it's hard for certain people out there. We need to be honest, and again, without sacrificing our commitment to allowing every individual their due human dignity, but we need to be honest about these differences so we can make prudent choices about who comes in and who doesn't. This is not a violation of some basic ethic. This is certainly not a violation of how America has been constructed for its entire history.
I think that's correct. And two things come to mind. And the first is this. My favorite thing about this phenomenon, this liberal euphemism that masks an obvious falsehood, it's parochial. I mean, it's the most parochial thing imaginable. And so you have the NPR American who's only lived in New York, D.C., and San Francisco, pontificating about the magical human equality of all cultures and civilizations. But the thing that you could do to dispel that in about 10 seconds is travel widely around the world. Yeah. If you actually visit these home countries, and look, I've done so: Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, elsewhere. Actually, wait, no, cultures are very different. Different groups have different average behaviors, and therefore they have different outcomes on almost any measurement. And some groups are going to be easier to assimilate than others. This is obvious. If a group kind of shared characteristics, language, culture, development, etc., are closer to the average American, it's going to be easier for them to assimilate than if they're further away. And so the example that I use based on some recent reporting is Norwegians would have a easier time integrating into the culture of Minnesota than Somalians. And that's
Are you sure? Are you sure you want to say that out loud?
Yeah. I mean, look, this is just true. And also Norwegians, and again, this correlates with race, but it's not reducible to race. Norwegians would have an easier time integrating to Minnesota than, let's say, Lithuanians or whatever. And so there's different levels, and the levels of particularity matter. But if you say something like that, people go apoplectic. They go crazy. They say, no, that can't possibly be true. You could show them as much social science evidence as you want. You could take them around, to little Mogadishu versus little Tokyo versus little Italy versus little whatever. You could actually fly them around the world to all of these various places and say, hey, look at the actual reality on the ground. And so you realize it actually takes a heroic suppression of reality in order to maintain all of these ideologies simultaneously. And the obvious, and the other thing is, and this is the second point I wanted to bring up, is there's an Anglo element to this, right?
Yeah.
And I know this from like my grandparents, my Anglo-American grandparents. Anglos are very, and if you go to Britain, this is like obvious. It happens, you know, a British person can insult you in like the most polite way imaginable. They can say something that is actually a grave and cutting insult, but they do it in this language that actually is so pleasant, is so polite, is so proper, is so refined that it can slip your mind. It can slip through the defenses, you know, if you're not used to it. We have this problem in America, again, in Anglo-Protestant culture, where in the past, Americans were very polite about these questions to say, you know, okay, we're going to kind of obfuscate, we're going to euphemize, we're going to be polite, we're going to maintain certain fictions out of a sense of propriety and politeness and a kind of spirit of conviviality.
Yeah.
But it becomes harder and harder to maintain that as the problems become deeper. And then as the left insists, no, you know, the fundamental unit of analysis is racial group, the racial group that has historically been the dominant group in the United States is fundamentally evil. I mean, multiculturalism, the whole theory that they're pushing, actually eventually will break through the layer of politeness and raise some of these questions to the level of reality, of blunt talk. And so when I say, Somalis are going to be harder to integrate into harder to assimilate into the United States than other groups of all varying racial backgrounds, depending on the particular nation of origin. For many people, that is like a step too far. We've breached some new territory. And I don't know what you think, but my sense is that the country is ready for a little bit more honesty on these issues, provided that you have a spirit that is not malevolent or divisive or polemical or bitter. If you approach it with a generally generous spirit, I think America might be ready to have some of these conversations.
I mean, yeah, you bring up a very good point here. And just to sort of reemphasize a few things is that we actually know, I mean, there's a lot of research to the effect that the Anglosphere, Western Europeans in general, the sort of quote unquote weird WEIRD peoples of the world are uniquely high in openness and uniquely anti-racist, actually, ironically.
Not even uniquely, but
some
like
of the least clannish,
the only group. Yeah.
Really. And so this is part of the grand irony. And there's some like interesting Evo psych explanation. I don't know if I totally buy all that, but like coming out of the second ice age, there's like maladaptive genes and you need to be more open
dude, all
to
that
like
stuff's BS.
Man. Okay.
Yeah,
but it's fine. We don't need to get into all that. The fact remains, wherever it comes from, it is just the case as a matter of how certain traits are exhibited now. There is a kind of real reluctance that seems to be built into this sort of very sort of this way of being that we want to preserve that allows for people to come in and sort of assimilate themselves and be treated and be given the opportunity to become one of these sorts of people. And I'm certainly grateful. I'm a recipient, as are you and like half of you, as a recipient of this sort of spiritual largesse that gets passed on to the rest of the world. And so far be it from me to be sort of overly critical of that, but at the same time, this does run against a kind of reality in which that openness, that kindness is being stress tested like never before, and it risks being completely upended by the mass of the rest of the world who now, for the first time ever in the history of mankind, have the resources to make their way relatively cheaply to these countries. And what do we do about that? Do we have the courage to protect this wonderful and unique inheritance?
Correct. And look, it wasn't easy for prior groups. We talked about, Jews, Italians, Irish. They had real difficulties adapting to that kind of neutral, accepting, fair dealing, tolerant, kind of Anglo style of commercial activity, of cultural patterns, and it really had to be kind of this big machine of assimilation. And I'll take Italians as the example. Italians had the mafia. They brought over this clannish criminal enterprises, insular, not open, not fair dealing. And I think it's incumbent upon those members of each particular group to openly, roundly, and repeatedly condemn the misbehavior emanating from their group. Yeah. That's not to say that every Italian is guilty of criminality or that they're responsible by blood towards, any kind of group level behavior. It's not that. It's merely a pragmatic recognition. And look, my family had this, like responsible Italian Americans who want to assimilate into the United States hated the mafia because it was bad for their reputation, it was bad for the overall community, and it was bad because it came from inside the house. And so famously, you have Italian Americans that are fighting the mafia, and then someone like Rudy Giuliani, the very Italian American, was the one who actually buried the mafia once and for all in the 1990s at enormous risk to himself. There was assassination attempts against Giuliani. And so I think it's totally reasonable to say, for example, hey, there's a huge fraud problem in the Somali community in Minnesota. It's incumbent upon Somalis and the leaders of the Somali community to push back against it, to condemn it openly, to insist on the norm of assimilation. But we're getting precisely the opposite. Ilhan Omar goes up to the stage, condemns me, condemns my reporting, pretends that the fraud isn't real, accuses everyone of being racist. So we're like a long way from that. And I think we have to confront it head on. Fortunately, in the Trump era, we have more openness than ever as far as conversation. And I think we should take any remedy necessary. And if a group like Somali fraudsters who are non-citizens, I mean, that's an easy thing. You have to go home. And other groups that have higher rates of assimilation, we have to, for everybody, anyone in this country, fight for people to integrate into that national identity to the greatest extent that they can. And I think we should end with like a lightning round. And one question I have for you, on a scale of 0 to 100, like how assimilated are you and how American are you?
I should not be the one to answer that. That's gonna.
Should I answer it for you and you answer it for me?
There is, some like maybe tribunal out there that gets to sort of levy judgment on those of us who have come at some certain amount of time, and how American am I? I'm going to have to pass on that question and leave it to others. I can say this. I think you're top 10%. I would say you're top 10%.
Deep,
like robust respect for being an American. And frankly, that is all I can be. Despite these other sort of ethnic particularities that I belong to, none of that is home to me. None of that is part of my self-identity, except for, in some like sort of almost trivial symbolic way. I don't belong anywhere else. In fact, the nations that my great-grandparents came from no longer exist. They literally no longer exist. And
what were they? What were they at the time?
Yeah. Well, on my dad's side, it's like kind of hard to say. We don't really know because the moment they got here, they dropped it. I mean, it was certainly in Eastern Europe somewhere. Probably it's a part of, could be very well part of Crimea that's being sort of fought over right now. Could be part of Poland, which at the time would not have belonged to Poland proper.
Yeah.
And in my grandparents' case, on my great-great-grandparents' case on the other side. It was parts of Dalmatia, which then subsequently became Yugoslavia, which of course balkanized and became something else. So it's sort of like hard to say, but I am strictly American.
If you were to get deported now, I think you would get deported to the front lines of the Ukraine war, Crimea. Yeah, that's where you would go.
Damn.
Do you think?
Yeah,
that's intense.
That could be the case.
Wow.
Yeah.
Get your paperwork together. And
right.
what's interesting
Stephen
about
Miller,
that too
take it easy on me.
Stephen, chill, relax. He's one of the good ones.
I have to now
He's
pass
one of the good ones.
Back to you. How American are you?
It's a great question. Like I on my mother's side, I feel like I am entirely American, right? These are old stock Anglo-Protestants, mostly from the London area, came to the East Coast, migrated over time to Michigan, my grandfather was, working on the electrical engineering for GM, like archetypally American all the way. They had one part of our family had married a Native American in Michigan. They were upstate Michigan. They had a summer business where they had trained bears, and you could take photograph with the bear, with like the chief, like my uncle or whatever. And it was like Ernest Hemingway book, okay, I am very American. On my father's side, less so, right? This is okay. Yeah. This is fine. I still speak Italian.
I
have
hate
a
to
home
be that
in Italy. Guy. I could do it. Like if I were to be deported to Italy, God forbid, please don't, Stephen Miller, please chill. I could probably root down completely easily, actually. Yeah. It would not be that hard. And so I'm like, I guess I'm multicultural, on one side. So maybe I thought I was going to be more American than you.
I'm committed. I was going
to razz you about it, but maybe you're more American than me. I don't know.
My ships are burned. I'm here. This is all I know. This is all I believe in. This is what I am. If I'm some kind of, if I can't make it to the like top floor where they discuss who is and isn't America, that's fine. I'll like do my bidding down below on the third floor somewhere. That's okay.
Like it's fine, right? That's ultimately what I think is so interesting, is that we can recognize the historical reality of American identity, where we are, where we spring from it, where we don't, and that's okay. And it's okay to say that somebody that whose family arrived on the Mayflower is more American than someone who stepped off of the immigration line yesterday. That's just common sense. It's okay. It doesn't mean that we should treat them differently. It doesn't mean that if they get a parking ticket, the rates of the penalty should be different. Yeah. It simply means that we are a creedal nation in the sense that you can become American. That's very unique. You can't really become Japanese in the same way. But also we have a tradition, a history, an identity, a religion, all of these things. And we'll all, we're joking about how American are you, but like that's okay. Yeah. You could, like wherever you fit, as long as you're contributing, as long as you're assimilating, I think that's good. And we can be lighthearted about it. And, one of the sad things is as ethnic jokes have disappeared, we've become less tolerant, and the great thing about ethnic jokes is that they happen when there's a sense of familiarity. And there's a sense of camaraderie. There's an acknowledgement of difference, but the underlying thing is something of respect. And so I remember growing up, my dad would have ethnic jokes with his buddies. And these were ethnic jokes like against other Italians from different regions. And then they would all unite to make fun of the French people. And those are gone. The intra-European ethnic jokes in the United States are gone. But maybe that's the solution. We need a little humor, a little levity.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's been a great week.
I have to say before we go, because we're going to have to do this again, because we didn't even get into H-1Bs. We didn't talk about all the ways that the immigration system's being manipulated. There's so much to cover here, like I said, and this is like the big issue of our time. So we're going to need to return to this at some point.
Part 1 has been completed. Yeah. Stay tuned for part 2. Make sure to like and subscribe, hit the bell, caress all of the buttons on your phone until you are a subscriber.